Welcome to the Honest Reflection Podcast with your hosts, Cody Hairston and Nick Woods. Here, we want to help you reflect on your week and be honest about your relationship with God. We hope you enjoy this episode. Hey guys, glad to have you in our conversation again this week. Nick is here with us again. How's it going, Nick?
Good. As always, it's good to be with you again. And I'm more and more, I think, growing from these. I hope that everyone else has been able to grow with us as we reflect on these things. We're going to continue to reflect on how we can live in a way that the fruit of the Spirit can be seen in us as we talk today. And today we're going to start reflecting on gentleness as a part of the fruit of the Spirit. So since it's a new month, we have kind of a new concept, a new term in this list that we find in Galatians chapter 5. So the first thing we're going to do today is we're going to read from Galatians 5. And I'm going to just start back in verse 16 and just read this whole paragraph to kind of put the whole context in our heads as we're reflecting today. Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 16, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, for these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Now those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. Let us not become boastful, challenging one another and envying one another." So as we're going to think about these things today, we're going to really zero in on gentleness there, kind of the next to last part of the fruit of the Spirit, and look at how God shows us his gentleness. We're going to think about what this gentleness is and kind of give us a way to talk through these things as we go over the next month, kind of looking at how gentleness should impact our walk with Christ as we live each day. So Cody, you get us started. How can we think about or define this biblical gentleness that we see here?
I appreciate you saying biblical gentleness because I think that's part of what we have to overcome when we're trying to understand this term, because the way that we normally use or think about the term gentleness might not be exactly what the Bible's meaning. A good example of this is the first definition that you would see if you were just, look it up in a dictionary for gentleness would be amiable, like in good manner, something like that. And while I think there are times where that applies, and gentleness is actually a little bit bigger than that. You actually get into it a little more if you go to some of the second, third, and fourth definitions. You'll see things about moderation, about restraint and stuff like that. And I think that's more in line with what the Bible's thinking. So the way that I like to think about it is gentleness is strength under restraint. Meekness and humility are very related to it, and especially with meekness, that's probably a definition that you might have heard for meekness. It's strength under restraint. And so it's not the idea that you are weak in any kind of way. In fact, you're strong and capable. I kind of think about like a wide receiver. Somebody might say, oh, they landed gently, right? It doesn't mean that wide receiver, that football player was weak in any kind of way, but the way that he came down was much more soft than you would have anticipated or than it could have been, right? So you are strong, you are capable of doing strong things, but you withhold that strength. Maybe the best example or analogy that I've heard used for it is the idea of petting a cat. A guy was talking about how he was trying to teach his daughter how to be gentle in petting the cat, because I think we all know, 1 and 2 year olds aren't the most gentle creatures all the time. And so she's grabbing the cat's tail, smacking the cat. And he's like, no, you got to be gentle, right? Pet the cat. Yes, you're strong enough to hit the cat, but we want you to pet the cat, right? So that gives you an idea of gentleness there. You have the strength, but you withhold it. And the second big part of gentleness, as far as how the Bible defines it and Bible people think about it, is it's also designed to bring a specific result. So you're not being softer just for the sake of being softer. It's because you think that being softer in this, or more gentle in this, is actually going to bring about whatever it is that you're trying to get to. So going back to the cat analogy, you want to make the cat happy. You want to keep peace with the cat and in the home. So instead of hitting, you need to pet the cat, right? Because that's what's going to bring about that result. And so when we're talking to people, right, our goal might be to get our point across. So we might use a gentle tone, because that's the tone that's going to help them best understand what it is that we're saying. If we are training or teaching our child, we will withhold some of our strength when we discipline, right? Because that's what's going to allow them to understand what it is that we're trying to get them to understand. So there's a lot of different ways that we're going to see this, and we'll see more of that as we go through. But Nick, how does gentleness compare with some of the other aspects of the fruit that maybe we've talked about already?
Yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting thing to do as we've been going through this study, is noticing, if we just look at, maybe the way we might initially think, or the way the English word is defined, there's a lot of crossover. But when you kind of dig a little deeper, you see that each of these terms has a very specific lane. And I think as we reflect on this concept, it's going to be important for us to see that it is different from some of the other parts of the fruit that we should be bearing. And so hopefully, I think we'll see is, while they have different lanes, they all work together. They mesh together in the life of a spirit-led follower. And so we'll be able to see that as we talk through this. But, you think about how gentleness relates to love. Of course, I think we would talk about love as being like the foundation, right? This is our commitment, our decision, our choice to be on God's side, to be with him, and then to treat others in an appropriate way. We do that. Gentleness is a part of that. It's an outpouring of that. Our restraint comes from our love of God, our love of others. And even with kindness, right? We might say, like with your example of petting the cat, and like, oh, you're being kind to the cat. Yes, that kindness flows through the gentleness that's happened, right? The restraint has happened. You said, you can hit that, you have the power to do that, but the restraint that keeps you from doing it then would result in a kind act potentially. It doesn't always have to be the case. The kindness, in the way that we think of kindness, might not always be the result of a gentle restraint. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think as we look often at God's actions, even when he rebukes, he's showing restraint. He's showing gentleness. And so I'm going to use this this may stretch and be like a far out example in your minds. But when the Israelites are at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up for 40 days and 40 nights. He's gone getting the law. And while he's gone, they build the golden calf, and God is angry and he's going to destroy them. And Moses stands in the way. And he pleads with God, and he goes down to speak to the people. And when Moses comes down, he sees the people. It says he's angry and he breaks the tablets. And I don't think there that he is breaking the tablets completely out of control. Nor later on, when the punishment comes, is God completely out of control, because the unbridled wrath of God would have wiped them off the face of the earth. And so the fact that Israel was still a nation after that incident proves God's restraint, his gentleness, and we'll see some more of that. So kindness and gentleness are two separate lanes, and so that's what we're trying to think about here. Also, we haven't got to self-control yet. That's next month, but gentleness and self-control are related. And when we think about restraint, obviously that is a control. You're controlling yourself. You're restraining your emotion, and in the way that it comes out of your words, your actions, and things like that. But when we talk about self-control next month, I think we'll see it's more about our ability to control all of myself and my desires. And so maybe a more encompassing general type of control, whereas restraint seems to be, as Cody mentioned, like it's gentleness, seems to be really connected to our reaction and interaction with others, because we're trying to get to a response. And so maybe that helps. Maybe that helps, gives us a lane to drive in while we're thinking about gentleness and reflecting on gentleness over this next month. But ultimately, I think we can see the practical nature of having gentleness be a part of our walking with the Spirit. It comes up so much.
Yeah, and I do think the way that you just broke that down, it was very helpful for me as far as creating a lane for gentleness. All of these traits, they seem to bleed over into each other, especially in the English way of speaking about them. I guess I wouldn't know too much about how the Greek functions with it, but like gentleness and self-control seem to be super related in English. But when we're thinking about gentleness, really we're mainly thinking about our responses to others. Like how do we interact with them when something happens that might create a harsh response? Gentleness is withholding that strength and going about it in that gentle way. So when we think about gentleness, like with all of the other traits that we've talked about, God has been gentle to us, right? He has demonstrated his gentleness for all of us to see. And that's true of everyone who's ever lived, right? Because if the wages of sin is death, then as soon as somebody sins, God could strike them dead and boom, that's just the normal way that things would be, right? But he's gentle in the way that he responds, gentle in the way that he disciplines us, and the way that he's disciplined people going all the way back to the beginning. The way I think about it, because God is gentle, he always uses the right amount of force to lead us in the right direction. Now, we may not always adhere to it. We may not always do what we're supposed to do, but God is going to use the right amount of force to lead us to where we need to be. And that's gentleness. He's not just unhinged and just blowing everything up. He's doing this with a purpose, where there's some intentionality behind it. Now, sometimes when we think about God's gentleness, from time to time, people they point to various actions by God and they say, "Well, that wasn't gentle." You think about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, or the flood, or any of the times where God has to punish Israel or one of the surrounding nations. They're like, "Oh, well, look at everything that happened there. That was not a gentle thing." And yes, it probably doesn't fit into our modern definition of gentleness, where things are supposed to be always peachy and whatnot. But based on what we've been saying, right, in all of those cases, God showed incredible restraint. You think about all the times he wanted to destroy the Israelites, and Moses is literally just talking with him about it. And so there's some restraint that's there. And also in all of those cases, he did what he needed to do to bring about the result that needed to occur. Right? So if he needs to bring about judgment, or he needs to bring about letting people know that they are wrong in whatever way that they're living, he's going to go about that in a certain way. Now, sometimes people aren't going to listen, right? So I think Sodom and Gomorrah would fall into that category. And so at that point, that's where the destruction comes in. So it's not that God wasn't gentle. In fact, he very much was all throughout the process. So we could talk forever about the different ways that God has been gentle, and trying to understand it the right way. But when we just go to the Bible, it really does, and we look at God's example of it. It really does help us understand what the Bible means for us with our gentleness, because God is not perpetually just soft in every single moment, right? Or and so because he's not soft in every single moment, I don't think it would be fair to say that that's the way that we're supposed to be, right? Our gentleness needs to mirror God's gentleness. And so there are times where God has to say what needs to be said, or has to do what needs to be done. That's not because he's not gentle. It's just that this moment called maybe for something a little bit different. The verse that pops into my mind is 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7. This is Paul writing to Timothy. He says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but one of power, love, and of sound judgment." And so he says, look, God didn't put you here to be, cowardice and always, just trying to make things work. He says he gave you the spirit of power, love, and sound judgment, to know, hey, when's the time to be even more gentle? When's the time to use this amount of power? When's the time to use that amount of power? He's given us the wisdom to discern those things. And so there are going to be times where you need to assert yourself, right? That I think that's okay. But even in those moments, again, it's not unbridled emotion. You're not just snapping just because you can. We're talking about wise and impactful responses to situations, and always keeping in mind, hey, what's the end result? What am I trying to get out of this? And so we've mentioned this before, but I think maybe it's especially true with gentleness, that we really need to let the Bible define these terms.
Yeah, and even as you were going through some of your thoughts there, it just hit me that this idea from God's perspective is always to get the right response out of His people, whether it's the Israelites, whether it's the world. So He wants people to be His people, and so like coming back to the example I mentioned earlier from Israel at Mount Sinai, it's like God's trying to get them to be His covenant people and to go and inhabit the land that He's promised to them. So there needs to be a response to say, like, I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people, and you need to understand how this relationship should work. At the same time, and I think we were talking about this beforehand, like, God is all powerful. What is He able to do? Any level of restraint that He shows to an enemy, right, could be considered gentleness. And I think we talked about that. Um, and so I think we do have to understand that in a lot of ways. I think when we're thinking about how we want other people to respond to us, uh, Moses, when he came down from Mount Sinai and he broke the tablets, was showing them what they had done. Then he rebukes them and he punishes them, but he's trying to get them to come back to God. And so I think sometimes we look at gentleness, we look at somebody who is rebuking somebody else. Well, you're not being very gentle. You're not being very. I think sometimes what we want gentle to mean is like we just don't rebuke, right? And that can't be it. That can't be what's happening here. And another passage that came to my mind in thinking about this is kind of helps with our idea of gentleness, because it can't prevent us from standing on the truth. It can't prevent us from defending the gospel of Jesus. So Peter, in talking about people being persecuted in 1 Peter chapter 3, he says now in verse 13, who is there to harm you if you're zealous for doing what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, those who would persecute you, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, honor Christ as Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, the ESV says, having a good conscience, so that you are, when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ might be put to shame. Don't stop defending truth. Don't stop defending and giving a reason for the hope that is in you. Stand firm on those things, yet show restraint. Yet give a response that is worthy of the person that you're speaking to, who is a image bearer of God, who is created by the Creator. And so keeping all those things in mind, I think, helps as well. We have a purpose that we are working toward. And so gentleness then is the outgrowing of the understanding of that purpose, I think, in that context. So it's completely different from what the world looks like, and really how the world uses this term, because it's not spineless negligence or a lack of a response or weakness in any way, but it's standing firm in an appropriate way, measured. I think you used the word wisdom earlier, having the wisdom here. You can't be gentle without exercising wisdom. So as always, I think we first see that God's way looks different from the world's, but we also must trust His ways are higher than our ways. His ways are better than our ways.
Yeah, I'm super excited as we go through the month and really try to practically break this down and see how it applies in different areas, because it can be difficult, right? And I hope that we're not saying it in a way where it's like, oh yeah, this is easy. We're obviously, because it's not like that. These things can be difficult to put into practice, but just a couple things to keep in mind when we're thinking about gentleness. That gentleness, it's seen in our thoughts, right? The way that we think about people. You can have a gentle thought versus a harsh thought. One of the things that I try to use as a cue for, okay, I might be moving away from a gentle thought here, is anytime I start thinking about absolutes, right? He's so blank. She never blank. He always blank. Right? It's like, okay, that's probably not a measured thought at that point. So I need to bridle that. Right. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And typically the thoughts lead to the other two things. So it's really important for us to make sure that our thoughts are gentle. But we're also going to see gentleness in our words, of course. Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away anger, but a harsh word stirs up wrath. So you can hear there, the goal is to turn away anger. And so what do you need to do in order to get there? You need a gentle response, a gentle answer. And of course, we're also going to see gentleness in our actions too. So the way that we physically would treat other people, any sort of abuse automatically would not be gentle. But it can even be stuff on like maybe a smaller scale. Like you can be gentle in giving up your seat for somebody, right? Because you are within your right, within your strength to keep the seat for yourself, but you see, hey, look, this other person needs it. I'm going to go ahead and give it to them. So again, if we're trying to see this in our lives, there are probably a lot of different ways that we're going to see it. But when we're walking by the Spirit, this is just one of the things that we're going to see. It's gentleness.
Yeah. And just kind of as we wrap up with this kind of thought today, I want us to think about Jesus, who showed us the ultimate example of gentleness. Because think about his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion. He said he could have called 12 legions of angels. All right. So we know the power that he had, yet he went to the cross. He didn't revile when he was reviled. He didn't spit on people back when they were spitting on him. He said, when he was asked a question, "Are you the Son of God?" "It is as you say." He responded. He stood firm on truth. He never rejected the true things that were said. He never responded in kind when he was being mistreated. So we see that example. While he's hanging on the cross, he forgives. While he's carrying his cross, he is comforting those who are mourning. He could have been yelling rebukes and doing all these things, and yet he instead was walking with the Spirit, and his life shows us how we should do the same. So like Cody said, it's not like this is an easy thing to do, but Jesus gives us a way. He shows us how to be gentle in practical ways and standing on truth and standing with his word. So 2 questions to wrap us up today. Would you be able to exercise the restraint that our Lord did if you had his power? I think that's a good thought question for this next week. And then just thinking about how we're being changed. How's God's gentleness changing us?
Thank you for listening to the Honest Reflection Podcast. If you like this episode, give it a like, a share, or even a comment to let us know how we're doing. We hope we've helped you think, reflect, and be honest about your relationship with God, and we can't wait to see you again next week.